Welcome everybody. I think we've got live today. Good morning and welcome to the Bush Broadcast Winter Webinar, Creating Climate Resilience on our Bush Heritage Reserves. My name is Matthew Taylor and I'm joining you today from Sydney's Northern Beaches, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gai-Mariegal people of Sydney's North Shore area. I'd love you to introduce yourselves and if you'd like to put in the chat your name and where you're joining us from, that gives us a sense of which country you're from and get a sense of who's going to be with us today. As you know, with webinars, we're going to have some time to talk with our guests today, and we'll also have some time at the end for questions. If questions occur to you, please do stick them in the chat as well, because that gives us a chance to think about how we're going to answer those. And we've got plenty of time at the end to spend some time on what is really quite an important subject matter. Hope you've got a cup of tea or drink handy. We're going to be taking a deep dive into a really challenging subject matter, which is how do you respond to climate change? Now, in our case, Bush Heritage owns and manages 42 conservation reserves, which covers 1.2 million hectares of Australia. But we also work in partnership with traditional owners and other landowners to manage a further 10 million hectares. And that's a lot of country. And climate change is going to bring some new challenges to the plants and animals that live in these landscapes. And so today we're going to talk to two of the people who are helping us chart a course that ensures that these special places can remain healthy country into what's probably an uncertain future. So joining me today are Dr. Rebecca Spindler, our Executive Manager for Science and Conservation. Hi, Beck. And we've also got Vikki Parsley, who's our Aboriginal Partnerships Officer for New South Wales. So welcome to our wonderful speakers. Their faces should be appearing on the screen. And so let's get into the first question. Beck, hello there. Looks like you're on some lovely country there. Would you like to sort of say hello and introduce yourself and tell us where you're from?
Thanks, Matthew. Hello, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, I have the privilege of being on gorgeous Bidawal country. I'm coming to you today from Yambala, and Yambala is a property that has partners in our Conservation Futures project. Yambala and Black Duck Foods people have come together to sort out today how we can all work together to make country healthy, and it's absolutely my privilege to be here on beautiful Bidawal, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that as I stand on Australian soil, I stand on Aboriginal land, regardless of where that is. So thank you so much. Hi, Matthew.
Well, Beck, the science is not only clear, but the evidence is all around us, isn't it? The Earth's climate is changing, and the warmer it gets, the more extreme weather events we're going to have to prepare for, both as humans, but also in terms of our stewardship of the wonderful Australian landscapes. And we know that temperature increases aren't going to be homogeneous and linear, but really quite messy and unpredictable. We could already seen droughts, we've seen floods, long summers, cyclones, high fire risk. How does all that increasingly fluctuating weather impact life on our Bush Heritage Reserves?
Thanks, Matthew. I think that's a great question. And I think, there's a dichotomy here, isn't there? That, the science is clear. Climate change is already here. We're already seeing changes of seasons. We're already seeing much longer droughts. We're already seeing much more intense fire seasons. And yet, looking forward, there's still an awful lot of uncertainty. As you mentioned, the unpredictability of weather patterns, of year to year, of season to season, how things are going to be different from day to day. Bush Heritage obviously already has seen the impacts of wildfire. We were impacted, although not as badly as others. We recognise absolutely that many others were impacted much more severely than Bush Heritage Reserves in the 2019-2020 fires that were just absolutely devastating across so much of the country. Fire is not a new thing to Bush Heritage. We see it often and we prepare assiduously for it. We work very, very hard to make sure we're ready for what is a natural part of the Australian landscape. Nothing could have prepared us for those 2019-2020 fires and the severity and ferocity of them. We will continue to work very, very hard to prepare our own landscapes, to work with neighbours and large landscapes where we are and where we work, and anyone who asks us really, to try and make sure that we are as prepared as a country as we possibly can be to reduce the likelihood and the impact of those very severe fires. We will continue to see droughts though. We're in a very unusual moment right now with 3 La Nina seasons in a row. That's not unprecedented, but we haven't seen it since nearly 80 years ago. So that's very unusual. We will flip back into a La Nina. With La Nina, we will see much drier periods. We'll see drought. We will see the kinds of things that we've seen on some of our landscapes already. Not only changes of seasons and different species responses, but actual tree die-off, where the water levels get so low that the trees simply cannot recover. They cannot cope and go through their annual cycles. But we have also seen flooding. And again, that's a very natural part of so much of the Australian landscape. Bush heritage reserves have seen flooding. We've seen heavy rains and we've been inundated through the channels of so many of our reserves. Because that is a very natural part of the Australian landscape, our properties tend to thrive in a flood. We haven't seen really severe negative impacts of flooding across our reserves, and we have seen many of the species that have persisted through those floods and even come back through the water. So it's really only when you start disrupting that flow of water by putting in concrete and tar and bitumen and those sorts of things that disrupt the ability of the earth to absorb that water over time and space that you really start to see the problem. So flooding is something that we have seen and we've seen more frequently, but actually it's been fantastic in terms of healing country.
Thanks, Beck. Well, I'd like to turn to Vikki now, because partnering with traditional owners is such an important part of Bush Heritage's work. And at our Tarcutta Reserve in southern New South Wales, there have been some really great initiatives with local traditional owners providing cultural knowledge and leadership in protecting country from the changes brought about by climate change. Can you tell us a bit more about this work, Vikki?
Thank you, Matthew. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands that I'm on today, my ancestral country, the Yuin Walbunja country on the southeast coast of New South Wales. Since we've been working quite closely with traditional owners, the Wiradjuri people at Tarcutta Hills, there have been some fantastic opportunities there where we have engaged with community to come in. It started with a background of looking at getting them to come out and start conversations on the ground about identifying cultural values on Bush Heritage Reserve. Through that process, we were also able to engage a couple of people from community to come through and do comprehensive plant surveys to identify the cultural values of those plants that are significant to Wiradjuri people. We were also able to then go in and get traditional owners to do surveys of any cultural physical objects that we have on that Bush Heritage Reserve. Through that process, we were able then to have discussions about long-term things that they would like to see happen. Through that process, we were able to also get some surveys in a written form with recommendations of actually undertaking cultural burns on that estate as well. That was seen as something quite important because the community at that time was saying fire had been absent from the reserve and from that country and landscape for some years since colonisation. And it was pretty evident at the time through the conversations that through Indigenous complex knowledge systems, people wanted to see that they could come back, have that reconnection and actually be proactive in managing that. We've had a couple of days as well where we've been out with staff walking around Tarcutta Hills Reserve. We've had a look at some of those values. There's also been conversations where community at this time actually wanted to follow through at a legal level as well under New South Wales cultural heritage legislation. They wanted to actually record those values so that, that the significance of those locations and the ability then, if they're protected under the Heritage Act, meant that at Bush Heritage, we could support the community in terms of being more self-determined in that process and being informed and being a part of the decision-making process as well on the reserve. So it's been leading down some fantastic conversations and pathways at the moment. And we're also looking at one of the biggest things we do at Bush Heritage, of course, is crossing over into the science and conservation space and working on the right way approach. So at the moment, the right way approach has been met with a lot of enthusiasm, and that's where Wiradjuri traditional owners would like to collaborate those complex Indigenous knowledge systems and work alongside of the Western science framework. So the outcome in the end is hopefully that we can achieve some better conservation outcomes and potentially share a lot of those knowledge systems as well.
That's fantastic, Vikki. And perhaps for the benefit of everybody who's joined us today, you mentioned the values at Calcutta Hills. I visited the place and was lucky enough to visit in spring when the wildflowers were just unbelievably gorgeous on the floor of the woodlands there. So it's a primarily wooded landscape with some grasslands in it, isn't it? But can you tell us a little bit about, your perspective on the values of that particular, area?
Being grassed woodlands as well, they're obviously from a conservation and Western science point of view, that they're high on the list for protection and conservation for future generations. Those ecological values are no different for the Indigenous people. So the Wiradjuri traditional owners have those same aspirations. They would like to see health restored to country. They would like to, of course, see that knowledge and that information and those plant species are managed there for future generations. Coming from one of the oldest living cultures in the world, where we have, such a strong system of oral histories, it's more important, I suppose, for Wiradjuri people to participate in that and be a part of those processes. They've identified that a lot of the plant values there are quite unique. There's been lots of conversations about medicinal plant uses. We were privileged to be out in the field a few weeks ago where one of those knowledge holders took us through and explained, there were plants there that were used for toothache and for headaches and a number of other different types of ailments. Mosses and fungi that were prepared as poultices to help, with skin conditions and disorders, and other types of fungi that we're using to help alleviate bronchitis and breathing-like difficulties. So, the values of those particular medicinal plants are really high on the list for Wiradjuri people. And of course, as I said, just align a lot with the Bush Heritage targets as well that we're trying to achieve at the moment.
Fantastic. Yes, thank you. And we've got a very interested hound joining us, I think, as well, which, of course, is one of the challenges of COVID. Not only might we get some technical challenges today, folks, because the bandwidth is struggling a bit in parts of Australia, but of course, we've got our canine friends who might join us. So moving on, Beck, last year, Bush Heritage launched its 2030 strategy, and that did a lot of work defining our priority landscapes. And it also identified very specific regions that we term resilient landscapes, which is resilient within them, the concept of resilient to climate change and other challenges. Can you help us with how that's characterized and what exactly makes a landscape, resilient in our terms?
Absolutely. Thanks, Matthew. So in summary, the resilient landscapes are really just the landscapes. We defined our priority landscapes some time ago before I even joined Bush Heritage, and they are defined by the areas in Australia that have a diversity of ecosystems that are underprotected in the National Reserve System and both the public and the private protected area network, and that are under threat that we can do something about, that Bush Heritage has the specific skills to do something about. within those landscapes, we looked a lot at expanding our understanding of climate change, but also other threats to all of the ecological and cultural values as far as we could understand over the coming decades to make sure that we identified, as we really wanted to double our impact and as we wanted to double the expanse of land that we helped manage and that we owned, we really wanted to understand where we could do that best with the greatest certainty. And the resilient landscapes are characterised by lands where we are really much more certain that we will be able to have that conservation impact into the future. That could be anything. That could be because the specific physical impacts and climatic impacts of climate change are going to be more manageable, or at least we don't have lots of evidence that they're going to be unmanageable, or they have significant refugia. And refugia are landscape features that we understand, and certainly Aboriginal people across the country understand what refugia looks like. They are landscape features or access to water or whatever it is that protects whatever biodiversity is there. So the biodiversity may change because of climate change, and we may be protecting different things, but if you have a significant number of sites with refugia, they often overlap with really culturally important and significant sites, but they're also areas that will support biodiversity much more strongly than areas that have no crevices and cracks and rocky outcrops and things that hold moisture and hold water and give you some of that temperature refuge so that whatever biodiversity is there is going to thrive into the future. These landscapes are characterised significantly, it's really important to say, with most of the landscapes that we have traditionally held partnerships with Aboriginal people. And if you look at the State of the Environment report for the last 2 or 3 reports, it's very, very clear that some of our best protected areas in Australia are managed by Aboriginal people. They're full of Indigenous protected areas. So we look at the fundamental condition of those areas. We look at our ability to help conserve into the future and make sure that those ecological and cultural landscapes, every ecological landscape is a cultural landscape, that they are as resilient as we possibly can so that we can really maintain that conservation effort into the future.
Yes, that's fantastic. And the next question, I'd like to also include a comment from Sue in the chat here. The next bit I wanted to sort of really ask both of you is, how is our right way approach to conservation, to innovation, and using technology to support adaptation and the mitigation of these climate threats? How is that done in a way that's respectful of the traditional knowledge of traditional owners? Because Sue has mentioned in the chat that there is always this risk and a concern that the knowledge can be misused or, not appropriately acknowledged and not appreciated. And that's something that is at the core of almost like the gene pool of bush heritage, to very respectfully approach conservation in a way that invites and includes and acknowledges that traditional owners have been doing this job much better than we have for a long time. How do we come together to now do it walking together? So I'd love to hear maybe Beck just a continuation, and then Vikki, I'd love to get your perspective as well.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. And this is a really critical point. I have to say, 2 years ago, when we first started really drawing in much more detailed information about climate change impacts across our reserves, I went into climate change depression. There's just no other way around that. And decision paralysis. I did not see a way out of it. I thought so many of the impacts that we were likely to see going into the future were really going to be very devastating across our landscapes. And it was through talking with Aboriginal experts and my friends that just made me realise it's time to dig in and take responsibility for this. We may not have done this. I mean, collectively, obviously, we have driven climate change. But we as individuals or as an organisation may not have caused climate change, but it is our job to make sure that the people in the landscapes that we've taken responsibility for, through partnership, through ownership, through whatever mechanism, we are doing the best we possibly can dig in and manage that land until the land works. And that's a phrase borrowed from one of my really great Aboriginal friends. And I think taking on that really active land management concept and way of thinking demonstrates really clearly the need for doing this in the right way. So working together, hand in hand, bringing different, not just different knowledge, but different thinking systems, different knowledge systems and ways of working together so that we genuinely have the best possible scenario. And today is a really great example of that. So if I can, let's just take a few minutes to tell you about what we're doing today. And this, I forgot to mention, this is not a big Band-Aid covering a zit in the middle of my forehead. We've been really lucky to have the Bidawal elders here today to be able to share with us knowledge of country, knowledge of history and land use. And we've been through a ceremony this morning to make sure that we're all coming to today with an open heart and an open mind and genuinely presenting all of the knowledge that we have and that we can share so that we're all working from the same background. And I think, the elders absolutely recognise, and there's quite a lot that they can't share with us because it's not our story, and that's perfectly fine. But they're able to bring so much fundamental knowledge and understanding of the past land use and the history of the change of this landscape, how people have managed that for millennia before we got here, but also recognise that some of those traditional ways may not be fully appropriate right now. We need to take a bit of an experimental approach and blend with some of the Western knowledge as well, because we've brought lipid-filled grasses that change the fire regime. We've made climate change the way that moisture works across the landscape. We've changed the timing of the seasons, So there are so many things that everybody recognises by coming together, and only by coming together respectfully with that open mind and open heart can we possibly develop a way forward together. And that is fundamentally, that is the right way approach in action, is open, listening, learning, and recognising, acknowledging and amplifying that Aboriginal voice so that we make sure that we're genuinely incorporating everything that we can learn, but also what we need to be thinking about, that very active, proactive, give ourselves permission to take that land in our hands and work it and manage it until it works for what we need to do.
Vikki, thanks, Beck. Vikki, is there anything you'd like to add to that or about your perspective on the right way approach?
Thanks, Matthew. That was fantastic, Rebecca. Just to add to that too, I know I've had some really good conversations with Rebecca on these topics. So just to clarify with people as well, Bush Heritage is quite good and well versed in identifying Indigenous cultural and intellectual procurement procedures. So from an Aboriginal partnerships perspective, we're guided by traditional owners on the amount of knowledge, the information that they want to share with us. So even when I spoke earlier about having traditional owners, the Wiradjuri people come out at Tarcutta Hills, the information that we were given and was documented was nothing that community weren't happy or didn't want, shared with the wider world. Some of it was quite generic information. We do have those conversations in Aboriginal partnerships about, if there's any sort of secret business that people don't want to discuss at the time, that's well within their rights to be able to own and manage that. And we are aware at Bush Heritage as well that there are a number of other models used in different parts of the country where some Aboriginal communities are working and managing that quite well. It's also identified that, some of those other community spaces may be lacking so much in that. So there's also that support capacity and that further governance that we can also add for traditional owners, so that when they are going out on country and they're looking at these things, that they feel comfortable enough to be able to manage that knowledge and information and be informed in that process as well. So that's a really big thing, and I think that it was well worth mentioning that we are guided solely by traditional owners in what they do want to share with us, and that is managed in the most appropriate and culturally sensitive ways that we can. There's also been some advancements as well with Conservation Futures, the project group that are actually looking at investigating some of those models, and I think Beck can probably add a little bit more to that. I've crossed over into that space. I've had some general conversations there, but yeah, the specifics of that's still a bit of work. There's more legway to take place before we can actually come up with, a model that is appropriate for everybody, I would imagine. And in some cases, there are communities that we are working with, traditional owner groups, as I mentioned, that do want to manage their own knowledge and information, and that's fine. And when we're talking about this whole climate crisis response, a lot of communities at the moment are pretty in sync. We're finding that the resilience of Aboriginal communities is quite high at the moment. A lot of traditional owners I engage with are making the same conversations and observations that I note on my own country, that seasons are changing. We are noticing that indicators are happening at different times of the year. I was having some conversations with some of the traditional owners down in South Australia a couple of months ago who were saying their seasons are 3 months ahead at the moment, and that probably is quite close and reflects what I'm noticing on my own country. So just being able, I suppose, to work a lot closer through that Aboriginal partnerships space, we are providing much more capacity for people to be involved at Bush Heritage and appropriately manage their own knowledge.
Thanks, Vikki. I think it's important to say that, as some examples, when we look to acquire a property and are able to do so under the sort of European sort of ownership model, the very first thing we do, and as part of our research before we even do so, is to establish who the traditional owners are, so that they can be invited, immediately on country to start to tell us how we should be managing it, and to do cultural surveys and to point out, what are the cultural sites, how should we be looking after that country. So right from the get-go, it's an approach of walking together into a landscape so that we have joint perspectives and can share knowledge and understanding of it. And over time, that develops usually into a beautiful relationship where we can invite traditional owners, particularly in the southeast of Australia, where a lot of the land has been significantly modified, but nevertheless, we can invite traditional owner families back onto country, often for the first time, to experience, their traditional land and places where their aunties and uncles can remember, being born and remembering bits of that country that are vitally important. So it's a wonderful part of that process to see the landscape coming alive in both in the people and also in the animals and plants and landscapes, which conservation traditionally looks after. So there's a few interesting questions coming up, which we'll get back to at the end. I'd now like to talk specifically about one of those tools that is increasingly being recognised as one of the most critical ones in managing our landscapes, and that's fire. We all know that Aboriginal people have been using fire for tens of thousands of years to look after, to manage, to nurture, and to create outcomes in a landscape across Australia through the very careful and thoughtful use of fire. So, Vikki, I'd love you if you could give us a sense of right way fire or cultural burning, which are alternate terms, and some of the ways that can actually support some resilient landscapes.
So at the moment, cultural burning, this is a new term that's kind of come about in the last maybe 10, 15 years. That is relevant to, in Aboriginal communities, we talk about right way and wrong way fire. So Rebecca's touched on earlier about the 2019-2020 devastating bushfires. That's probably what most people are more familiar with. That is from an Indigenous point of view in Australia, we're looking at that saying that that's wrong way fire. So wrong way fire as a definition, I suppose, would be one way to put it is any fire that is life-threatening, is out of control, can't be controlled, under good conditions, and obviously leads to a really large loss of biodiversity to our landscape. Right fire from a traditional sense is being able to read landscape. I know for myself and where I reside in New South Wales, the UN communities down here on the south coast have been quite proactive with cultural burning for some years now. Through those processes, you know, we go out on country, we would actually look at certain indicators. The soil is a big indicator and actually lets us know when it's time to light fires on country. And those fires can be for a whole range of different reasons. In the past, there's plenty of documented evidence that suggests that, you know, cultural burning was used to promote regrowth in areas where, say, for example, macropod species that may have been hunted and utilised for food sources may be absent from that landscape. So promoting burns of the grasslands and those kind of areas where those animals rely on those food systems actually promotes and encourages, you know, numbers and populations to come back again, hence sustaining food sources. In other cases, it may have been promoted, you know, to keep camps clean and free of debris, keeping the areas open and safe, so that when the mobs in the past were setting up fires, they had that, you know, cleared landscape, knowing that they were free of spiders and snakes and things like that with their children around the campsites. And it could also be, you know, for the purposes of promoting bush tucker regrowth, seed promotion, protecting arboreal species that live in the trees as well. That was one of the first devastating things I noticed with wrong-way fire from my experiences in my lifetime living on the south coast of New South Wales. In the past, it's quite surprising. There's arguments to and for, but we do know for a fact that cultural burns are undertaken on a more frequent time frame. They're under in much more smaller controlled conditions. So in light of that, they're actually a bit more manageable, and it means that you can have more control and say over, you know, particular landscapes or areas that may have needed that practice to go in. So at the moment, that right way fire is a significant tool, something that is becoming more and more of interest for not just Aboriginal communities as part of revitalisation, but you know, the bigger, broader approach at government levels too, in terms of asset management and how can we share and use that knowledge to protect you know, cities and towns and other areas that may have had terrible, devastating impacts in the past. So it's pretty exciting ground at the moment to be covering and to be investigating and working quite closely in particular with the Wiradjuri people at Tarcutta Hills Reserve. We're estimating it's been probably about 180 years since a cultural burn has been introduced to that landscape. So we're proposing at Bush Heritage at the moment that we can support the traditional owners, undertake some small cultural burns, start developing some case studies and do some long-term monitoring as well to see what types of results that we are getting. It's quite interesting to spend time out in the field with traditional owners and hearing elders and people talking about previous experiences that they've had. We've also gone out and utilised some of the Bush Heritage staff, so we've got our ecologists involved as well. So this is part of that right way approach that we discussed earlier, or I mentioned. There's some photos here now where you can actually see that there are some of our traditional owners who are identifying sites, looking at those cultural values, having conversations about the importance of that landscape. And, you know, because Wiradjuri people were absent from that landscape for so many years, it's become an amazing opportunity for the community to get back in there and be actively a part of this process. So there's a lot of well-being aspects through this. So it also helps with healing Aboriginal communities. A lot of traditional owners report, you know, that sense of pride, that feeling of reconnecting to country when they're allowed access back into those landscapes, and then actively being a part of that cultural burn. They always report this sense of, you know, that good feeling at the end of the day of they feel like they've cleaned house, done a bit of housekeeping and actually cleaned up through that cultural burn process. So it's creating some amazing opportunities at the moment and a really good space that, you know, needs to be documented and needs to be monitored so that we can share those results.
Thanks, Vikki. And I think we've got a video now to actually illustrate some of this work that has been produced by Firesticks, which is an Aboriginal-run organisation that looks to do exactly what Vikki's been talking about and share the knowledge and ability to use cultural burns across the landscape. So I think Megan's going to run that up for us now, and it's a 2.5-minute video which gives you a lovely insight into the human and the landscape effect of cultural burns.
Why we stand here today, it's where we've had our two fires come and meet. We've got good fire meet bad fire. So it's been a meeting place, and from these meeting places we have knowledge and we learn. Fire is medicine to country. We apply fire as medicine to create this healthy landscape. So when we burnt this 18 months ago, there was me, being the old fella, and 3 young leaders in our community walking through here for 13 nights, learning as the fire moved through the landscape, reading country through the indicators, and learning from the expression that the fire was giving us. This fire here had no one working with it. It had people fighting it, which is the wrong metaphor with fire. We need people not fighting fire, but walking with fire. And through walking through fire, we can create a healthy landscape. We've connected our grasses across the landscape, and these grasses provided passage for this fire to follow. And just like the rain, the fire would follow its own path through the landscape. So it harnesses the important relationships between soil, landscape, people, plants and animals. And it's that holistic relationship that creates a connection to country.
Fantastic. Well, that was a lovely insight into and an experience, I think, of what it's like to in the middle of a cultural burn. And as you can see, a very gentle and very measured burn, not at all like those we've experienced, in the last couple of years in the southeast, and indeed over time in all parts of Australia. So, Beck, lots of species have evolved to adapt to changing environment, and that's the nature of evolution, that we do change over geological timeframes. But many are actually unable to adapt fast enough to really rapidly changing conditions that we're sort of experiencing now. Can you give us any couple of examples, perhaps, of species on our reserves which are under direct threat and how we're able to support their ongoing survival?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. I think there's certainly many changes happening out on reserve on a constant basis. And we already are seeing quite a few different changes in, and I've mentioned a couple of times, change in seasons as well as change in sort of longer term conditions. So if we think about some of the most incredibly endangered white box woodlands, beautiful grassy eucalypt box woodlands that we see across Australia, they are disappearing. They are under threat, and they're further under threat from climate change just because of that persistent long-term drying trends that we see through El Nino sorts of systems that are very, very hot and very dry. We have experienced tree die-off on our Ngāru Hills reserves, and we are undertaking a significant experimental approach right now to figure out how we might be able to bring new genes of the same species into those landscapes to make them more resilient into the future. But we also see, obviously, with the drought, you have increased fire intensity as we saw in 2019, 2020, but we've seen on smaller scales as well. Those wrong-way fire, that wrong-way fire that Vikki was just mentioning, that can really have a significant impact on species like greater gliders, not just because they're impacted by the fire itself, but because those tree hollows that they rely on so strongly will disappear in a big fire, in a really intense fire. And they absolutely require those very old trees with the big tree hollows, as well as those species for the food availability. But it's really interesting to me, I think, and again, this is where we're learning so much and talking with elders and knowledge holders across the country around the change in seasons, the timing of those really intricately understood and integrated changes of seasons. What are the signals that seasons are going to change? What are the signals that migratory species might be coming through and that food is available? What happens when they come apart from one another? What happens when the migratory patterns are disjointed from the flowering patterns, where the food availability is absolutely critical to supporting those migratory routes? How do we start looking at what are the species that are going to be most vulnerable to some of those more subtle changes? And even so, again, on a seasonal level, looking at mulga woodlands, we're looking at a likely change in precipitation. We will get a drop in the rainfall overall, but we're also looking at a change in rainfall from being very spring, summer heavy to being later in winter. Now, that won't probably affect some of the adult mulga woodlands. They'll probably be perfectly fine, those established woodlands, but we need that summer rain for recruitment. So that's going to mean fundamentally, if we do have a loss of trees, and certainly over much longer periods of time, over decades, we will just have death of mulga woodlands by attrition, because that recruitment, those new mulga trees are not being able to come through. And then if I take that to the next level, these are all examples of things that we're really experiencing across the country. If we start looking at the pygmy possum and the honey possum in the southwest of WA, that biodiversity hotspot between the Fitzsterling Ranges and the Stirling Ranges and the Fitzgerald River, that biodiversity hotspot is the only place in the world where mammal pollinators like these species could ever have evolved. And they've only been able to evolve because the diversity of plant life in that area is so high that there's always a plant flowering every single week of the year. That is exactly what those mammals need to survive. They're nectar feeders. That makes them really great pollinators, but it also makes them fundamentally dependent on that diversity of species of plants that have, because they've had to eke out their own living, the plant diversity is so high because every plant is trying to use the resources effectively so that they can survive and not compete with any of the other plants in that area. It's why we have such rich biodiversity, and it's only because we have such rich biodiversity could we have those beautiful, beautiful little pygmy possums and honey possums. If we lose just 10%, 20% of that biodiversity of those plant species, what's going to happen to the honey possums? You know, above and beyond the loss of those plant species themselves, which is critical, that has so significant flow-on impacts for so many of the animal species that we're really trying to support, as well as the ecosystems themselves. And I think it's now beholden to us, and some of the things that we're talking about within Bush Heritage and with our partners constantly is, what is the technology? You mentioned technology before, and I neglected to answer that. What is the technology that we need to bring to this? And it is so much about understanding our landscapes better, having real-time data around moisture penetration of soils and moisture levels of trees and various areas really across the country. What is the likelihood that we're going to be able to intervene in time to stop tree die-off or to support particular species when we have exactly the conditions that we now understand are really going to lead to an ecosystem failure a species moving, arriving, leaving at times that they didn't arrive before? Do we need to supplementary feed? Do we need to try and get water into the landscape? What are the places and parts of innovation that help us understand and manage those landscapes a little bit better and really avoid the worst of those natural disasters, but understand the subtle changes as well and make sure we're ready and that we're responding in an appropriate way to make sure that we don't want to stop adaptation. Nobody wants to do that, but nothing can adapt if it's wiped out. So what we want to do is just really work together so that we can effectively give those, in the hardest moments, give those species and those ecosystems the best possible opportunity to survive so that they can keep adapting to those changes that we think they're going to see into the future.
Fantastic. Thanks, Beck. So we've reached time, I think, and we should probably allow a bit of time for some of the questions that have been coming through. Please do continue to chuck questions you might have into the chat. We've already got a couple in there, and we've also got a couple of comments from people. Thanks, Catbird, for mentioning Victor Stephenson, the Fire Sticks co-founder, and the reference to his kids' book. That'll be great for all you parents out there to introduce a bit of education. We've had a request for a little bit more information to understand about right way approaches from Trudy, and I think that's one we can probably answer offline, Trudy, and give a steer on where we might be able to source some additional information. But there are a couple of questions I would like to put to our panelists. Panelists, my friends, silly name, isn't it? There's a question here from Vanda, I think it was, and that's about how we coordinate with national and state and regional bodies who own reserves, and how do we liaise with them to facilitate the best outcomes? I know there's a huge plethora of ways that we interact at the science, the research, the land management level. Beck, would you like to give us a quick response to that?
Yes, absolutely. I can start, and then I'd love to hear Vicki's answer to this as well. But certainly in bush heritage, contiguous protected areas is something that's really important to us. That's one of the best ways we can build resilience, is having landscapes that are, and I always liken this to a fabric. So if you have a fabric, think about a linen, a really consistent linen that will carry weight, that will be resilient to change, that will wrap around you and keep you warm and keep you safe. That is the equivalent of a contiguous, thriving, protected landscape. If you have lace work where there are lots of holes in that area, it will withstand less weight. It will protect you less. It will still be beautiful, but there's so many of those changes really undermine the resilience of those landscapes. And that is fundamentally true. So wherever we can, working with whatever protected area, so we work very closely, obviously, with Aboriginal partners, managing Indigenous protected areas extraordinarily well. We partner with national parks and other environmental NGOs to build those contiguous protected landscapes so that we can manage together. That saves us all resources if we can coordinate and manage the threats across the landscapes together, but it also means that we're much more effective across the board.
Yes, thanks, Beck. And Vicki, feel free to respond to this as well, but I just, so you can respond more comprehensively, there's several questions come up that I think you'd be able to answer. One of them is, in terms of, you mentioned some indicators for cultural burning that are used to determine how and where and in what way. Can you tell us about any of the other indicators used by traditional owners in their assessment of, I know it's a very specialist question, but if you can give us some insight to that, that'd be very helpful.
Yeah, that's a really good question, but at the same time, there's not a really clear-cut answer to that one, because the complex Indigenous knowledge systems apply to so many different landscapes and environments. So even if I had people come down here on my country and I walked country with you and took you out, you know, my answer could be completely different from, you know, people down in South Australia to the Territory, depending on, that specific environment. And I don't think there's a clear-cut sort of answer. That specialist knowledge is retained by the traditional owners from different communities and areas that, have lived specifically with that landscape, have very intimate knowledge of the way that the plants, the animals operate. And in some cases too, it's that shared knowledge. In the cultural burning space at the moment, there is an openness between traditional owner groups to be able to share knowledge, and even at the moment, I suppose it's a bit more of the revitalisation of that. In some instances, some of the communities I'm working with have lost that information. That's where other groups are, openly saying, well, they can come down here, work with us. There seems to be a lot more consensus across the board at the moment in trying to share that and get that back out there. But in some cases too, there's other groups that I'm working with that, have the specifics and still follow ceremony and law practices. And some of that system itself actually dictates and governs when traditional owners would go out on country. So yeah, I can't really answer that specifically, but I think if people are interested in it, it's about investing a bit of time and trying to develop relationships, or, sourcing at your local level and participating. There is a wider approach as well, where we're starting to open up that cultural burning space. So I can share, for instance, with the Tarcutta Hills Reserve, even though we're working with Wiradjuri people at the moment, there are conversations about opening that up at a later time once the Wiradjuri people are comfortable and have had, I suppose, first priority there in land management, and using that as a tool to come back in and reconnect with that landscape. But later on, there are conversations about sharing that knowledge more widely. So I think, as I mentioned before, it's an exciting space that people need to kind of gauge and watch at the local level at what's happening around them.
Yes, thanks, Vikki. And you have touched on one of the other questions that came in from Eddie, which was asking about that those gaps in knowledge that we may have lost through, loss of that knowledge as people have passed on. But the question was, is the incorporation of traditional knowledge through the partnerships we're talking about, does that give us a chance to identify gaps in knowledge, and can that be resurrected? And you've already given us an example of where other traditional owner groups can help fill those gaps sometimes. And I'm aware that in the work we do, often it's a case of identifying the potential gaps arising, because some of the aunties and uncles who have that knowledge need to share that to pass it on to the next generation, don't they? So a number of our ways we support traditional owner groups on their land and on our properties is to support things like capturing that knowledge and capturing it in a way that is useful in passing on that law and that understanding, not just taking the information and putting it in a nice picture book that is only of use to in the cities. So working collaboratively on those sorts, and I know that as an example in Barilli in the central western deserts, that's one of the projects we're doing on the importance of the plants there. And you talked, Vikki, about the importance of medicinal and food plants. So there are a number of ways we can fill those gaps. Is there anything else you can add to that story? Because I think that's a key to keeping the knowledge systems alive and being able to interact.
Just, I suppose, from my personal experiences lately too, working with traditional owners in the cultural burn spaces, I can say from my experience there, I'm even going into different country that I'm not familiar with and looking at how the behaviour of fire is acting in grasslands, for example, at Tarcutta Hills, because the landscape that I live in on the southeast coast, we have these big, beautiful native forests, and they can vary so much from temperate, rainforest, coastal habitats and heath areas. So the variation of the way that fire behaves in that type of a landscape is completely different again. So it is really important to continue through the bush heritage space to support traditional owners to be able to engage. And that's another thing that we're pretty good on in Aboriginal partnerships, is being able to help support traditional owners to increase their governance practices. And, if other opportunities come up, I'm no stranger at the moment to being a part of those, supporting conversations to get people together with fire crews, and that type of stuff at the moment is coming forward in a really big way. There's lots of vested interest. Just on another sort of side note to that, some of the communities I've been supporting down here on the southeast coast are actually working alongside the rural fire services. So when people were asking before about how we collaborate and how we work with other organisations, in this particular instance, we've actually got a pretty deadly team of Aboriginal fire rangers down here who are actually going out. We do workshops with the RFS, we give them talks for a day, and then actually go out and do demonstration burns in the fields. And the feedback from that has been hugely positive and very supportive, with that growing interest now to go to other areas and support and give that same type of experience to other rural fire services. So people are definitely open to that idea and working in collaboration.
Thanks, Vikki. And there's a lovely comment from Bev here saying about having attended a Fire Sticks event on Yorta Yorta country in Vic, and just how powerful that was, having that experience and the importance of learning, and how that learning is slow and steady and doesn't necessarily fit the 9-to-5 schedule. So, and I have a friend who's a fire brigade captain locally as well, who likewise has flagged the importance of incorporating these different learning methods and skills. So thanks for that answer. Beck, I think there's maybe a last but one question, for a couple of questions for you. That's a question about whether we've done soil biome studies to look at the causes of tree decline, because they usually, when trees die, it's often a combination of factors, and pests come in and finish them off, but it might be water stress that starts it. And a link question, because you mentioned water data, and that's about how we partner with organisations like the Bureau of Meteorology, and I'm guessing perhaps CSIRO more commonly, in terms of integrating our science knowledge.
Wow, okay. Sorry, I'm going to try and remember the first question. So tell me the first question again.
Yeah, do we use soil biome studies as well as water data? Yeah. Yes.
So we have, and one of the things that was really interesting in that example in Nadu Hills, where the trees had died off, we've done complete soil biome analysis, and there's so many things in that. There's so much past history and different land use in so many of the different patches that are part of that experimental design. We gathered as much information as we possibly could about that land use before designing it, so it's well and truly controlled for and taken into account in the experimental design. Biome information has been really interesting, and that previous land use has had a really significant impact. But the die-off is much more uniform than that. So it's possibly part of the answer, but not all of the answer. The other place where we've really started looking at soil biome is using eDNA with partners at Flinders University to understand why some of our restored landscapes in that Fitzsterling, where the pygmy possum and the honey possum were evolving, or have evolved, and where they're inhabiting right now, understanding why some of our restoration plots are not quite as diverse in terms of the sedges and the forbs and some of those smaller plants as the remnant veg. So we're really trying to bring that understanding of microbiome in the soil very much to all of our work across the board. That's 100% right. And in terms of water, we collaborate with everyone around water. Water is absolutely fundamentally important from every perspective. And we look at it from a large landscape satellite as well as drone information to understand the behaviour of individual waterways and rivers and channel country and all that sort of thing. We're working significantly with the BOM, Bureau of Meteorology, who give us really important information, but CSIRO, who again have developed a lot of really interesting data and ways of looking at soil penetration of water using satellites, but also taking on board. We're working with a startup company who's developing on-ground soil measurement and analysis techniques that then transmit that information to us real time, so that we can be sitting in our offices and understand that soil moisture penetration and so many of the levels of really critical nutrients that are so important for native species. But we're also, again, to take this point further, taking on more and more understanding from the traditional owners of landscapes where we work and understanding what is critical to understand, what is critical to know. And I would like to touch on too, just that conservation futures again. We never ask our traditional owners to share any more than they're willing to share and that they feel that they're able to share. The Conservation Futures system that we're building, and this is back to technology, is going to be a place for people to safely store knowledge. And by safely store it, I mean as a knowledge holder, the person who gives us that information gives us very strong rules really around who can see that information. So I would log into the system as a white female, no Aboriginal heritage, working for a conservation organisation. And as such, I would be able to see the world of information that is only allowed to be seen by me, being a female and not of Aboriginal heritage. One of the things we're really hoping to do with that is facilitate peer-to-peer sharing of knowledge as well, because a lot of the Aboriginal groups would really like to have systems where they can store their own knowledge and hand that down from generation to generation, but also share with that mob over there without bush heritage getting in the way. We don't need to see that information. We shouldn't see, in some cases, we shouldn't see that information, but they need to have the ability to be able to share that. And we're really hoping that's something we can facilitate through Conservation Futures.
Thanks, Beck. That's fantastic. Well, we have actually run to time now. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Beck. Thank you, Vikki, for sharing your insights and experience of such a complex and comprehensive subject. It's been great to have everybody on board and contributing their thoughts, their ideas and their suggestions in the chat. Very much appreciate that. The last person I'd like to thank, who isn't expecting it, is our producer, Megan Pritchard, who puts together these wonderful webinars all year and puts together the wonderful slideshows. So Megan, if you do want to show yourself and be acknowledged, I think that would be very lovely. And if you don't, oh, there we go. Fantastic. Megan's in our office in Melbourne, and she's the brains behind these wonderful webinars that we have on. So thank you for producing, and in particular for putting on the lovely slideshow you're about to see. Now, Megan told me that this one is entirely trees. They're a favorite, and so our closing slideshow, if you'd like to stick around, will be some beautiful shots of the trees we've discussed and some others that we haven't. Thank you, and see you all next time, and look forward to sharing some more fantastic stories from bush heritage. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.